This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Think about this headline. Facebook use predicts declines in happiness, new study finds. Well, guess what? It probably will not surprise you that one of the authors of that new study is my guest today, Ethan Kross. Let me quote a line from Ethan, which really sums up what's going on here. On the surface, Facebook provides an invaluable resource for fulfilling the basic human need for social connection. But rather than enhance well-being, we've found that Facebook use predicts the opposite result. It undermines it. Ethan is a social psychologist at the University of Michigan. He has dug in deep as to how these types of platforms are affecting us, what they are doing to us Homo sapiens. I agree with him right out of the gate. There is good and there is bad. And we need to start to think about the bad. If we don't, generations of kids are going to be raised as freaking zombies. And those zombies are going to have some very poor mental health. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ethan Kross. There's a couple different areas I want to go today, and you probably are going to know where I'm going to go into your kind of greatest hits and stuff like that. But I want to know a time, a place, an influence, a mentor. At what age did you start going down this direction, studying behavior, wanting to know more about how the mind works? I'm sure there was multiple times and influences, and it was not a straight line, I'm sure. But is there anything that you can trace back to as a young man, maybe high school, college, where you just, something happened where you're like, wow, okay, this is my direction?
I recently wrote something up along these lines, so I can give you the timeline. It started pretty early. I'd say around the time I was 4 or 5, I had this unusual dad who would, whenever something wasn't going well, and by not going well, I mean, maybe I wasn't called on first or second to be on the wiffle ball team in the neighborhood or didn't get a treat, he would ask me to, quote unquote, in his terms, go inside, to essentially introspect and try to figure out why I was feeling the way I was. And that usually led me to feel better. So in other words, go inside, figure out what's driving this negative feeling and come up with an answer and then move on. So that was the way I operated.
So he saw you feeling down or glum or whatever, and his mechanism, his tool that he saw as a parent was to send you inside to contemplate.
That's right. And I did that for quite a while. It started with not getting the second chocolate chip cookie when I was a kid, but through high school, you ask someone out on a date, they say no, that kind of stuff. The standard trials and tribulations of adolescence. And it was just something that I took for granted. I just did it. It worked. And that was it. And I was generally well adjusted. Then I got to college and I took my first class in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And about 3/4 through the course, we got to this work by this pioneering psychologist named Susan Owen-Huxma, who unfortunately passed away prematurely a few years ago. She spent her career studying and, quite frankly, becoming famous for demonstrating that when people do exactly what my dad told me to do, when lots of people do it, it doesn't make people feel better when they introspect, when they're in a bad mood. It typically makes them feel worse. It leads their negative feelings to become prolonged. It leads them to ruminate. So that created a giant puzzle for me, which is, why is it that at times people's attempts to, quote unquote, go inside and make sense of their feelings succeed, lead them to feel better, provide them with insight. We know that this ability to introspect is an amazing human superpower, if you will, right? We can learn from our mistakes. We can plan for the future, but it can also be an Achilles heel. So that's what I went to graduate school to study, to try to figure out. And I've been working on it ever since.
As you say, the paradox, you're supposed to look inward and find some clarity, but then the reality is that doesn't necessarily make you feel better. Let me ask a follow-up to your father's technique. When did you realize what he had done? Was it a good realization, or it established the paradox?
My dad wasn't a clinical psychologist or anything like that. He had an interest in Eastern philosophy. He was always reading about that kind of stuff. You know, he took me to get a mantra when I was a kid. So he certainly had that interest. I certainly knew that most kids, when they turned 5, didn't get a mantra for their birthday. They got something else. So I had that awareness, but it never in any way, it was never intrusive.
As I think about, though, the notion of looking inward, would it be the same thing? For example, I'm thinking of myself when I've had assorted issues, let's say a relationship issue. I've always enjoyed talking to other people. I would think that would help me. But now looking back, when you leave the heat of the moment, looking back, all those conversations, I don't know that they did help me. So I guess if the introspection is either solo or sharing with others, is there a difference? I'm assuming there is, but maybe not too much of one.
Other people, it turns out, can be either an amazing asset or a vulnerability. A European psychologist named Bernard Rimet, he's in Belgium. He spent his career studying when people share their emotions, what they're experiencing, what happens when they do. And what he's found is that pretty much across the board, when people experience intense negative emotions, they have this real desire to share them with others, to talk about them. Now, what happens is sometimes when we talk about them with others, in an attempt to make sense and work through them, it doesn't make us feel better. It makes us feel worse. And that's because many people think that the key to being a good listener is to ask you to just, why don't you tell me about what happened? Oh, really? How did you feel? To essentially cue people to start thinking more and more about the most aversive parts of their experience. And that tends to keep the negative feelings alive. You can, in fact, though, and some really skilled listeners do something different. They pivot and get people to go broader when you talk to them. So they try to help the people that they're speaking with put their experience in perspective. And that can be an invaluable tool for helping people work through the emotional problems that they're facing. It's the same basic process that we find that is really useful when people introspect in a healthy way, this ability to take a broader perspective on their problems. So you may have been talking to people who were very empathic, but not necessarily skilled at getting you to pivot and go broad.
A simple example maybe would be, let's say somebody was having a relationship problem, an ending of a relationship, and you want to share with somebody. You share with the first person, and the first person is giving you feedback where you continually focus on the person, the problem relationship that's just ended, whereas maybe the second person is getting you to think about the broader world. Hey, there's 7.5 billion people on this planet. You don't really need to stay focused on the one that just went bad.
You've just nailed the key mechanism. There's something so interesting to this phenomenon. We've done some experiments on this. There's this enormous temptation to just want to spew out what we're feeling when we're in the midst of experiencing something very negative, whether it be heartbreak or sadness or some other negative state. We just want to get it off our chest and keep talking about it. And I think it's very easy. I've certainly been in this role to just try to be supportive and validating of our friends and partners. Really tell me more about that. And, just kind of cueing them to keep egging them on. But what the research suggests is that the best thing to do is show some support and be validating initially. So you don't want to be dismissive. Someone comes to you with a problem, you say, well, let's take a step back and go broad. You can't just do that. There's an art to this, right? You want to show some support and validation, put your hand on their shoulder, but then start nudging them to think about the other fish in the sea, so to speak. And that can be quite helpful.
You mentioned experiments. I hope I'm not putting you too much on the spot, but is there any one experiment in this headspace that you and I are talking at this particular moment that you might want to share? Does something come to mind that would have been interesting to us mere novices of the mind that get to live vicariously through you and your lab? Is there an experiment that might be interesting to us that you could share?
The former graduate student, David Lee, did a set of experiments a couple of years ago. What he was really interested in was looking at how this dynamic between people, how we can talk to other people about our emotions in a healthy way, plays out, not directly face to face, but increasingly in the digital world that we live in. So what we essentially did is created this text message platform in the lab. And we brought people into the lab who had recently experienced an unresolved negative experience. A lot of those for college students that we were focusing on take the form of rejection, not a pleasant emotional experience, as I'm sure you know. What we did in the study was we essentially had them talk about their experience with a research confederate. So this was someone who was essentially a trained actor who we had coached to respond to whatever they told them in a particular way. So they had a script essentially that directed how this talking partner responded when the subject started talking about this painful event. Now, in one group, the students talked to a confederate who essentially coached them to recount what happened to them. The purpose here was to just be supportive and validating, right? Tell me, that's terrible, but tell me more about what happened. What did you do? Where did it happen? So they were focusing the subject on the what's. What did you feel? What went down? In the other condition, the confederate did something different. They found out a little bit about what happened to the subject, but then as soon as they knew the context, they started cueing them to go broad. Well, why do you think this happened? Looking at the bigger picture, how big of a deal is it? And so forth and so on. And what we found after the study was that the people who spoke with the other person who was just supportive and validating, their negative affect, their emotion levels skyrocketed from the beginning of the study to the end, a big increase in how upset they felt. But the people who were speaking with the person who was skilled at just nudging their perspective, getting them to go a little broader, those subjects were completely buffered against experiencing an increase in negative emotion. In other words, they came out of the conversation feeling just as cool, calm, and collected as they had when they first arrived at the study and didn't know what they'd be getting into. What I like about that study is it tests this idea that we've been talking about experimentally, but it also does so over a digital platform, which is increasingly the terrain over which people are sharing things about their lives and their emotional lives in particular.
Did you have a rough idea in advance of how it was going to unfold, or was the aha moment there for you at the end as well?
Well, no, we went into that study with a specific set of predictions. We expected to see something similar to what we ultimately observed, and that was driven by earlier work that we had done trying to understand what makes introspection helpful in some contexts and harmful in others. So just going back to that puzzle or paradox that we started talking about earlier, lots of research over the years has shown that one of the reasons people go down the rumination rabbit hole, if you will, when they try to introspect about their lives is because they become totally immersed in their experience and they think about what happened to them and what they felt, and the emotions really start clouding their ability to think objectively about what happened to them in ways that can be useful for providing them with insight and closure. And in that work, what we find is the ability to take a step back, if you will, to become an observer of one's own experience can be really helpful for allowing people to think more objectively about their situation, to put it in perspective. In the study that we just talked about with the text messaging, what we wanted to see, does the same set of principles explain how to be a good social support provider? That is, not getting people to rehash, but instead getting them to go broad.
This is just the coolest subject, to be able to sit here and just pick your mind. I don't get to exist in your world, but I get to know that you are spending a severe amount of time with associates drilling in and going into the details. And so I get to just sit here and just jump in and be back in school. I love it. Let me do a slight shift on you. So I think this is going to really trigger a A lot of people to think. So when I think of social media today, I'm still a guy that started with blogs. So I'm old enough to still look at the way that I use social media, not unlike my first blog. I still push things out. I will have debates and discussions with people, but I generally don't really check out what people are doing too much. I don't really follow what's going on. Now, I have noticed that I do follow a little bit more on something like Instagram. It's a little more insidious in how it works, I think, in terms of getting your attention. It's all photos. But I was thinking about laying this social media construct out, and I've got 2 teenage nephews and a teenage niece. Now, if I was to explain to them how I view social media, I would say something like this. Well, there was this Greek girl named Kardashian. She did a sex tape. Then she had a younger half sister who then used some of that fame and now has made $1 billion company. And now everybody on the planet of an age wants to emulate them. But to my niece and my nephews, I'd say, but hold on, here's the statistics book. Let's start to understand probability. And we're probably not going down a good path if we're looking to model them or imagining we're going to be like them. Now, as I say all that, that's not exactly how the world is working today. I have a feeling I'm on the outside looking in, and what's really going on in social media right now is not so pretty, is it?
I think social media, I think we're living through a moment in time where the very way in which as a species we interact with one another is rapidly shifting, which is incredibly exciting. It's exciting and terrifying all at once. We're thrust into this new universe, if you will, where the universe is rapidly changing. And what I mean by that is, so if you go back to the early 2000s, let's start with Facebook. It wasn't the first online social network, but it was certainly the one to take off. We have this new ecosystem for interacting with each other, unlike the offline world, where from the moment you come out of the womb, to a certain extent, maybe even before, if you believe some of the studies, you're being socialized for how to interact in the offline world. But we now have this new online world, and the rules for interacting with it, like we haven't received lessons from our parents about how to navigate that space, or from our friends, because we're all thrust into this universe for the first time, and we're forced to figure out how it works on our own. Now that's challenging enough, but now consider the fact that every few months or years, the physics that characterize how this universe works are changing, right? You have one little tweak to an algorithm that can change what pops up when you wake up in this new digital universe, or the infrastructure changes when a site does an overhaul. So you're left with a really, from a scientific point of view, a really interesting puzzle here, which is to try to figure out how interacting in this new space, which people are increasingly spending time in, is influencing the way people think, feel, and behave, both in their digital but also non-digital lives. And that to me is a mind-blowingly interesting question.
And it's gonna have, at least I've been saying this to myself, I'm a guy that I got all my college done pre-1994, pre-internet. So I like to say to myself that I can still imagine pre-internet, but as time goes by, it's harder and harder to imagine that. I was gonna say, well, gosh, what is the research showing me as a 50-year-old guy versus my teenage nephews and niece in terms of the understanding of how these social media platforms are affecting us? Are we all kind of converging to the same issues, or is there an age-related scenario unfolding?
We don't yet definitively know, in part because this space is so rapidly evolving, and the research that is coming in is like nothing that I've seen, in the sense that I'll get asked to review new papers on this topic every week, which is very unusual, at least for me. I mean, if we go back to some of the other work that I've done on introspection, I get a paper to review once every couple of weeks or months. But here we're having multiple papers a week. So the scientific world is clamoring to understand this new territory, and lots of findings are coming in. So it's a little bit sloppy, not in the sense of the science, but in the sense of trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together. Now, the place that I think the most work has been done, and certainly the work that I'm most familiar with is, and that my group has worked on, is in adolescence and young adulthood, looking at social media usage. And there's a fair amount of research demonstrating that certain ways of interacting with these social media sites are more harmful than others. One distinction we've made is between people who go on social media and passively browse their networks. So this would involve going into Facebook or Instagram and just scrolling through, seeing what's going on in other people's lives. Now, one of the things we know about social media is that people tend to curate how they appear online. There's very good reason why they do it. We curate how we appear offline all the time. I think about what I wear before I go into the office. I don't just go in my pajamas, right? I comb my hair. I mean, so we're always doing curating, but social media allows us to really exponentially enhance the degree to which we can curate with
photoshopped lives.
There you go. So we can really do it well. My favorite example of that is, a couple of years ago, we did a family photo shoot. It sounds too glamorous. We hired a friend to take photos of our family for a holiday card. And it was one of the worst experiences of my recent adult life because both daughters were just, they were not having it. The last thing they wanted to do was smile in the Arboretum. There was a lot of coaching that mom and dad were doing to try to get them to cooperate. And yet, when you look at the images that came out, they're beautiful. The one out of the 700 shots came out really great. And so that's a curated image. And essentially, I think what we see happening online is people are putting those curated shots, those perfect images of their lives online. Now, there's a long history of basic psychological research which shows that when you are constantly exposed to the glorified lives of others, when you're bathed in a universe where other people are seemingly outperforming you on some dimension, their life, that leads to a very simple outcome. You feel worse, right? It promotes jealousy and envy and not feeling good. And what we and others find is that when people are passively scrolling through the sites, we see that playing out in the sense that feelings of jealousy arise and they feel worse as a result. So that's a passive kind of usage. It's what we find when most of the time people are on social media, young adults anyway, they're using it passively in that way, and it doesn't lead to wonderful emotional outcomes. The flip side to that is using social media more actively, using it to try to connect with others, to chat, to exchange information. There, the results are a little bit more mixed. They range from those kinds of activities not having any effect on how people feel to actually having a positive effect, right? Bringing people closer together. So how those different findings generalize to older age groups, I'm not entirely sure how they play out there.
You're saying, honestly, this is so fresh. This is so new. We are studying it as fast as we can. We're in the lab, but clearly there are some things we just don't know what this is doing to us.
That's right. Well, I won't say it further because I'll just be repeating what you said. So,
let me ask about the studies that you have done. In particular, I know that you mentioned Facebook and the younger adolescents. Can you describe how those studies have unfolded, those experiments have unfolded, and your process? I think that would be interesting to hear because you're giving some statements and you're not a guy that's just saying things because you feel it. You've gone into the lab and you've done the work. But would you describe how you have done some of your work with Facebook and getting some of the results that you have uncovered?
Sure. So if we go back to I think they're called the early aughts. That's the early 2010s when Facebook was really revving up. Not, of course, to the degree that it is now, but back then it was becoming quite popular. Purely as a side interest, I became really curious about what this new network was, how it was affecting people. Because, I'd be lecturing in the large lecture halls on campus here. I'd be walking around and noticing that the students all had a Facebook window open while they were supposed to be listening to what I was saying. And, and I would have a Facebook window open at home too. And so it just seemed like an interesting puzzle. The first thing I did when I started getting interested in this question is what most scientists are trained to do when they have a new question. They go back to see what we know about this issue. That is, in formal terms, we did a literature review. When I did that literature review, I came across some studies which found the more people use Facebook, the worse they reported feeling. Other studies said the exact opposite. The more they use it, the better they feel. And still other studies said it's just more complicated than that. Whether Facebook is good or bad for your emotional life depends on how depressed you are, how many friends you have, what your self-esteem is like. And when you put those different lines of work together, it created another one of those puzzles that we've been talking about so far. It just became really challenging to make sense of which way the technology was influencing us. So one of the things that my colleagues and I noticed about these early studies is that they were all cross-sectional. What I mean by that is they typically took the form of you give a person a questionnaire and you ask them to simply rate, how do you feel right now and how satisfied are you with your life? So that's your life satisfaction or well-being on the one hand. And then you give them another questionnaire and ask them to rate, how much do you use Facebook in general? And questions along those lines. These were useful. I mean, these are useful methods, but relatively crude in the sense that you're asking people to make these broad retrospective judgments about what they're doing. And we know from lots of work that people aren't always accurate in estimating how much they do particular things. Our judgments are often biased. That method also doesn't allow us to tease apart cause and effect. So the methodology that we decided to use, and a colleague of mine who's a co-author on this work, John Janidis, was really instrumental in suggesting this, was to do something called experience sampling. What experience sampling involves is sending people in the current age text messages throughout the day. And each time we text message you, we ask you to complete a very short set of questions like, how are you feeling right now in the moment you get the text? And then also, how much have you used Facebook since the last time we asked you? And we send these texts every 2 hours on average. So then the question really focuses people on a very recent moment in time that their judgment should, in theory, be pretty accurate about. So our first study, we text messaged subjects for about 2 weeks, and I think it was either 5 or 7 times a day, we asked them those questions. And what we found was the more people reported using Facebook during one moment in time, say 9 to 11 a.m., the more their positive mood dropped from the beginning of that period to the end. So in other words, I wake up and I'm feeling like 9 out of 10 on the positive mood scale. I use Facebook a lot and my mood drops to a 6 or a 7. If I then lay off Facebook for a while, my positive mood goes back up. And that was the dynamic that we saw playing out across time, across our participants in the study. The one interesting little sidebar on that study was we also found that we also asked people, how much have you interacted with people directly since the last time we asked? That is, either face-to-face or via phone. And what we find is that direct social interaction is actually associated with the exact opposite outcome for well-being. The more you engage directly with other human beings, the more your positive mood increases. So that was our very first study on this. And it was admittedly a crude study because, as we acknowledged, and other people also, in some cases, vociferously brought to our attention, there are lots of ways that people can use Facebook. So in phase 2 of the work, what we did is we essentially repeated that design, but we asked about how much people use Facebook actively versus passively to try to laser beam focus in on what the key ingredient was that was driving these negative mood increases over time. And that's when we found that it was really this passive usage that promotes the negative well-being results. So that was the first layer of methods. We've since followed with actual laboratory experiments where we manipulate things, allowing us to draw cause and effect conclusions. But that's how it got started.
Is there anything coming out of your work right now that, from a pure business standpoint, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, that makes him happy?
It's a funny way of putting it.
That's a very diplomatic response.
I want to be clear about something. I do not think that social media is an environmental toxin that is to be avoided at all costs, like asbestos in schools. And I hope that little soundbite is never cut up in the wrong way. But I really do believe that this is a new technology. I think the challenge is to understand how it can be harnessed to promote rather than undermine well-being. Let's take a step back for a second. There are lots of ways that we can navigate the offline world that will make us miserable and sick, right? There are lots of ways that we can navigate this offline world in ways that provide us with enormous warmth and joy and satisfaction. I think the same thing is true about social media. The challenge for scientists is to figure out what the levers are that promote the healthier, more adaptive ways of interacting with this technology. I don't think it is all bad. I think the default way that many people slide into using this for many good reasons tends to promote more harmful outcomes, at least among young adults. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways of making it useful. Just to put this to be even more specific here, to put my money, so to speak, where my mouth is, we've actually published a study where we show just how useful Facebook can be for providing people with social support in, I think, a very interesting context. If we go back and we focus on people who have major depressive disorder, so clinical depression in the way that most people think about that disorder, one of the things we know about people who are clinically depressed is a quite sad finding. We know that they have social support networks that are impoverished. If you index how much social support people with major depression have, they get less of it than people who are healthy, and they accurately perceive themselves as getting less social support. Now, that's problematic because one of the things we know is that having supportive social relationships is a real asset when it comes to not only our emotional, but our physical life. There's been an amazing amount of research showing just how powerful those positive social relationships can be for our health and well-being. And one of the reasons why we see this relationship between depression and impoverished social support is because people who are depressed tend to talk a lot about their negative feelings, and that paradoxically ends up pushing their networks away. Right? Because it can be really hard to be there for someone else who's constantly talking about how negative they feel. It's a really sad, I think of it as just a sad dynamic. So what we wanted to look at with social media was, might this change the way the social support equation functions for people who are depressed? Might having distance, the distance that this network provides between people and their friends, might it allow people to actually be more supportive in response? So what we did in one study is we got permission from our participants to scrape their Facebook walls. So everyone consented to this. We essentially pulled on their walls, off of their walls. Every time they talked about something negative in their life, we coded it. And then we looked at how their networks were responding. Were they responding with support or not? And we did this for both people who are depressed and a control group of non-depressed, healthy individuals. And what we found was, in direct contrast to all of the prior work showing that people who are depressed get less support from their networks offline, on social media, it was the opposite. They actually got more support. So to me, that's a major, major win for social media. What it suggests is that the technology can be strategically harnessed to help people navigate their lives if we use it in a very deliberate way, that is, to try to get support when we need it. If you look more broadly to social movements that have been quite revolutionary in a mostly positive way recently, things like Me Too, Black Lives Matters, and others, you can see evidence for this playing out on a much broader societal level. So I hope that makes clear that social media is not something that is inherently evil or toxic. It very much depends on how we use it. And I think the challenge for science is to figure out what the pathways are, and the challenge for everyone else is to figure out themselves how to navigate the technology in ways that serve them rather than work against them.
Before I move you to an issue that I think is near and dear to you and a great story about a very famous basketball player. But we all have to acknowledge, though, that yes, you lay out the case of like, wow, there's some great uses here for social media. And then you lay out the case, like, hey, personal responsibility. But then there's also the issue of like, gosh, a lot of us are probably just damn well addicted, and we're addicted to tools that have major corporations that are working every day to keep us glued to those tools, probably giving us the things that we really don't need as much of, the things that are giving us that shot of juice every moment, the recent like or whatever. So, I mean, I hear you that like, we want to get to that point where the tool can be used in fantastically useful ways for the advancement of humanity. But I do worry that the way these tools can unfold, especially with young people, addiction and keeping eyeballs glued. Back to the beginning of our conversation, it's a messy something that's not yet unfolded completely, and we don't know necessarily what it's going to all look like.
What you're touching on is the issue of regulation, and whether regulation is something, government regulation, that might be appropriate here. I think it very well might. But I'll also just raise the idea that there are lots of things that are regulated in the offline world as well, for many of the same reasons that you just hinted at in your comment, right? There are ways of taking advantage in this new virtual world that can be quite harmful for people. And when the equation is tilting too heavily towards one party that might have a vested interest in doing something for whatever reason, make money or anything else, that can be harmful, I think that is a place to seriously consider regulation. So I by no means think that the onus or burden is solely on the consumer. There are at a minimum three parties here. There's the consumer, there's the provider, and then there's the regulators. And I think what we still as a society need to figure out is how to balance those three forces. Right now, I don't think they're balanced at all. I think we are very much in this wild, wild west period where we're still shooting from our hip and figuring out how things all fit together. And, amidst that, we're going to find some good and some maybe lots of bad things too.
You make a great point. And the libertarian side of me that would always just be like, this was a great business idea started by many different people, many different platforms, many different social media platforms, successful, Twitter, Facebook, etc., Instagram. But when you start to see behaviors that really directly tie to these operations, and look, the last thing I want is more and more and more and more government, but at some point in time as a society, we also have to be honest with ourselves. And if the data supports and that we are seeing behavioral change with, for example, let's say a particular young cohort or something that's not good, then we do have to look at regulation. You have to. Otherwise we're being irresponsible.
Certainly put it up for debate and be transparent about what the issues are. And, of course, see what the people want.
I agree. Okay, let me take you to a fun story which really brought back some memories for me. And we're going to get into something that is another part of your world. You've got a lot of different areas that you go into, but there's something that I found really fascinating, which just I've never, ever, ever thought about this, which was, I've thought about self-talk, but I've not thought about it the way that you described it. And especially this example with LeBron James and his decision to leave the Cleveland Cavaliers and go to the Miami Heat a few years back. Why don't you outline that scenario? Because you, with your background, spotted something quite quickly that was really interesting to you that a lot of us outsiders probably did not see.
So if you go back to, I think it was 2010, LeBron James faced what it seemed, at least to the outsider, to be one of the most difficult emotional decisions he faced in his career. The issue was whether he should stay with the Cleveland Cavaliers, which was the team that welcomed him into the league and really nurtured his career from its inception. Does he stay with that team because he was on the verge of becoming a free agent, or he had become a free agent? Or should he move on to other possibilities, other markets? Miami, I think New York and LA, or Chicago were up for grabs back then. What LeBron and his team ended up doing was creating an ESPN special to publicize what his actual decision was going to be. They aptly called it The Decision. And the viewership was as large as like the Summer Olympics or something that it was competing against. It was really just this event that many people came out to watch. So I tuned in as a sports fan to see what he had to say. At one point during the interview, he did something that I thought was just very curious. He said, the one thing I didn't want to do is make an emotional decision. LeBron James has got to do what is best for LeBron James. And so he started off by talking about himself as we usually do in the first person. I didn't want to make an emotional decision. But the moment he uttered that goal, that if you self-control goal in many ways, I didn't want to be emotional, he then switches to using his own name to refer to himself. LeBron James has got to do what is best for LeBron James. So I just found that super interesting. And it got my colleagues and I to start thinking about what that actually represents. Is that just a simple quirk of speech? Is that something that maybe celebrities who are in front of the camera do?
Narcissism?
Or might it represent something more? Might it reflect a way that people actually use language? The currency of the mind, if you will. The words we use to reflect on ourselves. Might he be unknowingly trying to regulate himself by changing the words he uses to reflect on his life? That has launched a series of program of research in which we've tried to answer that question and figure out, does switching from using one's own name, from I to using one's own name and other non-first person pronouns, does that serve some self-regulatory function? The short answer is yes, it does. We find that when people shift from thinking about their lives using I to their own name, that helps them control their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors under stress.
As I'm thinking about it, when I read this, I thought to myself, how do I do this? Because, of course, the ego in me is so big, I must think about myself. No, but I thought to myself, okay, when I'm having a stressful moment, something's going wrong. Do I have self-talk, either internally or out loud, where I say, I screwed up, I messed up, and I thought to myself, now this is not any kind of like pat on my back. I'm just trying to think about myself. I don't do that. Now, I don't necessarily know that I say my name all the time in self-talk, but I know I do sometimes for sure. But I know that I don't ever reach for the I. And going through your work, the thing that's so clear is to go for the I part just kind of is more stressful. Whereas if I say to myself, oh, Mike, man, you messed up. You failed on that one. That's actually very supportive.
So first of all, one big, giant, huge star and caveat that we need to convey to everyone is that the way we've studied this is not in talking out loud. Talking out loud is a related issue, but in all of our studies, when we look at self-talk and how different words we use to think about ourselves when we engage in self-talk, how that influences us, it's always the silent conversations we have with ourselves. It's not the out loud conversations. And we could come back to why that distinction is important. But I just want to clarify that we're talking about our internal self-reflective thoughts about our lives. Now, most of the time, I would argue that when you or anyone, at least in Western cultures, are reflecting on their lives, they're usually thinking about them in the first person. That is, we think about, how am I feeling? What are my feelings like? Or what do I need to do? I need to do this. So first person singular pronouns, that's the default way that we think about ourselves. But we also, of course, have this capacity to use other reference for ourselves, like our name. And some people, perhaps like yourself, are quite skilled at doing that by default when they're struggling with something important, when they're trying to, let's say, work on a problem. So, Ethan, put the screw here and then you do this rather than I need to do that. That can be very helpful, switching away from the first person into using your name for helping people achieve their goals under stress. Let me tell you about why that is, and then we could go back to some of how this all plays out organically, because I think the why it is very important. If I were to ask you, have you ever faced a situation where a friend comes to you with a problem, they're ruminating about it, they can't think straight about it, and this is a very, very intelligent, successful person, but nonetheless, they're overcome with emotion, And when they pose the problem to you, it's relatively easy for you to coach them through it. Has that ever happened to you?
I'm sure it has. I think sometimes, though, it's easy for me to see what they're dealing with, but sometimes it's hard to coach them through.
And in terms of the seeing part, are you able to see things that they're unable to see?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at observing things, probably in a way that probably causes people to think that I'm paying attention too much, but I just observe the human condition all the time, all around me. I don't know if I've got any skill for that type of coaching, but I'm very good at observing.
And, the observing is, for the purpose of the question, that's really what I'm hitting at, this idea that you as an outsider to someone else's experience can weigh in on it in a way that can be useful and in a way that the person coming to you often can't. And so you've got distance from their problem. And there's lots of work showing that getting distance from a problem can be very helpful for allowing people to see new things, to act more wisely, to think more wisely, and essentially work through events. Now, one of the ideas behind this whole line of work is that the ability that people can get distance from their own problems, and that these linguistic shifts, going from I to LeBron James, if you will, is a route for doing that. So how might that work? Well, if you think about it, 99% of the time that we use names and other non-first person pronouns like you or he or she, we're using those parts of speech to think about and refer to other people. So there's a very strong association between names, non-first person pronouns, and thinking about others. So going into this work, our rationale was, what if you use the language of others, if you will, to think about yourself? Might that allow you to think about yourself more similar to how we think about others, right? With more psychological distance. And that's exactly what we find, that when you cue a person to think about an emotional issue from their past or future or something they're going through in the moment, using their own name, that provides them with some psychological space. It's more similar to how I might coach my friend or daughter through the problem they're experiencing. Maya, you need to do this. Don't worry about it. Let's get to the problem. You can do it. And in fact, that's the script that we find activating when we tell our participants to use their own name to try to deal with problems under stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's what you're ultimately trying to do in your work, if I'm seeing your world correctly, is you're looking to be in the lab, find these insights, and then figure out ways that you can translate those insights to the rest of us so we can use them practically.
That's exactly what we try to do. If you think about the brain and the mind like a car, scientists, we're mechanics in some ways. We're trying to figure out how the mind and the brain work. In my lab, we're really interested in trying to understand how self-control and emotion control work in the various ways that process is relevant in daily life. So part one for us is trying to figure out something important scientifically using the scientific method. And then once we have a sense of how something works in the mind, we then try to translate it to see how it can be useful for improving the human condition more broadly. We traverse that span from the very basic level to the more translational applied.
I find the example with LeBron James so interesting because I'm sure back in the day when I watched that, I'm pretty sure I watched it live, I probably would have heard that statement. I would have definitely not drawn the conclusion or drawn the insight you did, but I'm sure, and I mentioned this word earlier, I'm sure I would have taken it a little narcissistically. Whereas whether he was doing it on purpose or not, and it doesn't really make a difference because he's figured it out. And a guy at that level of athlete, for any of us to think it's only physical is crazy, because obviously that guy is as good as he is because of his mental strength. It's really interesting that he maybe has figured that out and figured it out at a young age, that really helped him to navigate the waters that he's been navigating his whole career.
I think it is fascinating that LeBron does that. I'd love to to ask him whether he was even aware of it. I suspect that lots of people do this without being aware of it. And in fact, we've done studies. We don't tell people to do this. We just spontaneously look at the degree to which they do this when they're under stress. And we find actually that people are more likely to switch into this distant self-talk, if you will, when they're experiencing stress than when they're not. It's about 25% of the time. We're currently running a study to look at this. Let me give you some other counterexamples to just address the narcissism thing. The LeBron James story is a difficult one in some ways because it's autobiographical in the sense that that really was the impetus for one of the impetuses for doing this line of work. But the narcissist question always comes up because who would do this on a camera with millions of people? It seems strange. Well, it turns out LeBron James is not alone. If you look at what I think of as the antithesis of narcissism, Malala Yousafzai, you'll find that she has done the same thing. So Malala Yousafzai, the youngest person, I think still the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. This is a Pakistani girl who was a champion of young women's rights against the Taliban. She was lobbying for little girls, to receive an education.
They tried to kill her.
They tried to kill her. They shot her in the face and she recovered. And on an interview with Jon Stewart a couple of years after this devastating event, he asked her, essentially he did what I would do if I had the chance to talk to her. What went through your mind when you found out that the Taliban were coming to kill you? And she says something like, I was very scared, but then I thought, if they come, what would you do, Malala? You would take a shoe and you would hit him. So she does it herself. She switches into using language to switch modes, to reason through what is arguably one of the most stressful experiences any human being could contemplate, someone trying to assassinate us. So you see it happening organically there too. When I talk about this to audiences, I challenge them. I don't challenge audiences too often because I never know what they'll say, but I challenge them to call Malala a narcissist. Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, the real person equivalent to a warm blanket when you're sick, has also done this. If you look at his recent biography, in moments of self-despair, he's switched into using his own name to try to coach himself along. And there are myriad examples along these lines. Most importantly, we have actually done research now to look at the links between narcissism and using this distant self-talk. And we find that there's no relationship whatsoever.
That's my bias showing for some reason that I would have assumed that.
First of all, you're not alone by any means. We on our team were curious about it ourselves. The most important, I think, thing to keep in mind is that with LeBron, we're talking about talking out loud. And I think there may be a difference between people who do this talking out loud to others versus doing it internally. Everything that we've studied is really internal. If listeners are going to try this on their own, I would encourage them to do it internally. We don't know exactly how it works. There's a violation of social convention when you refer to yourself with your own name in conversation with someone else, and that can have other kinds of negative effects, I would think.
You know what you're really getting at, and you mentioned it earlier, is this is all about the science of self-control. And I find that's a fascinating topic that one of the many paths that you go down, but the notion of self-control, because I mentioned that I'm an observer of people and it's pretty easy to observe. Boy, there's a wide chasm of self-control from people that have none to people that perhaps have too much. It's definitely a fascinating topic.
It certainly keeps us interested.
Where can we send people? I know they can find you easily at the University of Michigan. Is there a web page, a website that we can send them to? I could keep picking your mind all day, but where can we send people? Where would you like them to go?
They could check out my lab at the University of Michigan Self-Control and Emotion Lab. And there'll also be a book coming out next year in 2020 that talks about a lot of the things that we've discussed today. It's tentatively titled Chatter. And that should come out in the spring of 2020.
I will definitely have to reach out to you and keep me on a list. I would love to have you on to talk about that, talk it through. I'd love to read it. So that'd be great news. I actually kind of was thinking that today because I didn't have for some reason or another, I didn't check, but I was kind of thinking, okay, I don't think his first big book has come out. Maybe he's done, I know he's done a lot of papers and everything, but I was thinking, this sure smells of a book.
Yeah, well, if you come in my office at home, it is reeking because I've been hard at work on it for the past year and a half, but it's coming. So it'd be great to chat with you again about it. That'd be wonderful.
Ethan, thank you for taking some time today. I appreciate it.
Appreciate the questions. It was a great conversation. Thanks so much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.